And so I ended up calling FBI SWAT Commander, Henderson SWAT Commander, and North Las Vegas SWAT Commander that we've got relationships with, and telling them, here's what we've got. Here's the best available info right now. Keep in mind, this is fog of war. Everything is very much in flux right now. And told them, begin heading that way and start paying attention to the radio, and keep in mind that, we've already got police cars that are getting shot at. So as officers are getting close in their unmarked SWAT rides, they might want to consider how much they want to keep those emergency lights going, because they could draw fire from wherever this person is. We had not identified where the shooter was at. It was very, very fluid situation. So, I remember as I was heading to the event, as I'm leaving my driveway after making all those phone calls, that, one of the nuggets of information that had floated out as you're listening to the radio was people were running across the runway at then McCarran, now Reed International Airport.
Welcome to the Transition Drill Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Pantiani. I appreciate you taking the time to watch. So let's get into this. Where's hometown for you? I see you're wearing an OU shirt.
So I'm wearing an OU shirt just because it's Saturday, and I got my undergrad from OU. So late, right? Like a lot of us got it with the new online plan, but been to the campus a few times to a few games, but hometown, born in Buffalo, New York, and so I've got a lot of relatives up in upstate New York, and but I grew up all around the world as an Air Force brat. Most of the 70s I spent in Germany, and following my dad around, but I've been in Las Vegas since '84. Because my dad got stationed here at Nellis, and pretty well been here ever since, with one brief trip out to the Bay Area. Lived out on the peninsula for about a year in Mountain View, and then came back when my number came up to join the police department. So, I've been here most of my life here in Southern Nevada.
Big family, sisters, brothers?
Nope, pretty small family. Just my mom and dad. My younger brother, we're 5 years apart, and so relatively small. And that's probably what had an impact in me, deciding to stay here in retirement, here in Las Vegas. And then my wife, Mary, of 30 plus years now.
Congratulations.
Thank you. We have two sons, both of whom are police officers with Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department as well. So they're on that path. And then we've got two grandkids from our oldest son and his wife. And so Las Vegas is our home. That's where we've got roots now. So, it is what it is. Her parents, her father's retired Air Force as well. And they live here in Las Vegas. So everything kind of angles back to, the Las Vegas area, in terms of roots, really, nowadays. So,
What'd your dad do in the Air Force?
He was a pharmacy tech. So he went in back at the middle of the Vietnam War. So they had the only openings for officers at that time was pretty much pilots and navigators in the Air Force. So while he had a bachelor's degree, his eyes were bad. So he did not qualify for that. So he ended up going and actually enlisted despite being qualified to go as an officer. And he did 20 years. And then when he got back from the Gulf War, he was done. Yeah, he hasn't worked since. He's managed his money very well, and he's been able to be that proverbial millionaire next door, where he just kind of hangs out and does what he wants to do, and since the early '90s. So he's in a good spot.
Growing up, what was your life like? Were you active with sports? Were you a good student in school?
I was a pretty good student in school until I decided I didn't like doing homework because I didn't see the point. Right? I liked to do really well on tests. And I thought that was the point, not seeing the big picture at the time. And I know I frustrated my parents, but I played some sports. I wasn't, super. I played football primarily through high school, but nothing that generated any interest in college or anything like that. But just almost got roped into going into the Navy, into the Navy nuke program, because those of us in our physics class at the time were told to take the Navy nuke qual test just for kicks, and I think 4 of us passed. So all of a sudden, recruiters were at the door and sitting in my parents' living room and trying to get me to bite. Right up until they explained that, hey, if you wash out, and it's got a high washout rate, and there's a lot of math, and I wasn't a big math fan at the time. So
going back to that homework thing.
Yeah, back to that homework thing. I was like, they're like, if you fail out, you're going to be swabbing decks. So I'm like, yeah, that's kind of a high risk for me, and so I ended up kind of getting cold feet, and I backed out. Didn't end up going into the military. Even though as an Air Force brat, I developed an affinity for all things military and kind of a military history buff. But my brother did go into the Army. He did 3 years and out. My oldest son went into the Marine Corps, did 4 years, came out as an E5 as a sergeant before he came onto the department. And so it goes through the family, although it kind of skipped me a little bit.
Growing up and being able to move around so much, where did you find that you enjoyed the most?
Oh, I would have to say Germany. Absolutely. The climate there is awesome. Very similar to Oregon in a lot of ways. Having visited there, it just reminded me of Germany in retrospect. And Germany, I didn't realize how great that was until, you come home. And I think the only thing that we missed that we didn't have there, because you're watching AFN, Armed Forces Network, is commercials. So we didn't have that pop culture reference, until I hit, probably the age of 10. We moved back to the States and ended up in upstate New York in Syracuse, just about 150 miles east of Buffalo. So that was, looking back, the schools are high quality. The teachers that they've got there on the bases are great. There's really no politics. Everybody's equal. And so you grew up in that unique small town kind of environment on a military base where there's accountability and that small town atmosphere, although you don't really realize it at the time. And I didn't realize until joining the department, what a real sheltered life I actually lived until, you come on board and, they teach you to shoot and they take you out on the street and you start getting exposed to things that you didn't get to see up to that point in time in your life. So that absolutely, I think, positively impacted me and, my upbringing and worldview and yeah.
So you mentioned taking the Navy aptitude test. I'm assuming that was probably your senior year of high school?
Yeah, that's right. Physics was senior year. Chemistry was junior.
Before taking that test, was the military on your radar?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Having grown up, super comfortable on military bases because we were dependents. Even, when we moved to Vegas, my parents bought their first house. We weren't living on base anymore. That part of town, the east side of the valley at that time in the early 1980s, that was where all the military families lived, right? Because a lot of the newer communities that are here now, such as Summerlin, Green Valley, things like that, they just didn't exist. It was dirt. And so everybody lived relatively close to Nellis Air Force Base. Creech Air Force Base wasn't Creech at the time, it was just Indian Springs Auxiliary Airfield. And, the Thunderbirds would go out there and practice sometimes, but it did not have the footprint that part of the valley does in the Northwest with the drone program that's out there now. I mean, just about every single drone mission that's flown around the world it pretty much is right there in the little trailers out in the desert. So, I mean, that base has grown exponentially. And so the folks out on that side of town, at that time, there's only 10 high schools in town, including the private one, Gorman, that is now, nationally recognized for its sports programs and things like that, we're at like 40 high schools, in the valley. So the town has shifted markedly. And, we just have kind of all the kids that pipelined through that part of the valley, had similar backgrounds with some variations. And, they had a strong ROTC program. I wasn't a part of that. But having grown up on military bases and with the sound of jets flying overhead all the time, that was normal. And then as a dependent, even though we lived off base, we had the stickers on the car. So, we'd go use the gym, the base gym, the base pool. So it seemed like a logical place to go. It just wound up that I didn't go. And it wasn't, we took the ASVAB. I think everybody's familiar with the ASVAB. But that wasn't what we took. We took the Navy, the nuke math and science test, basically, that screens for aptitude for their, MMRs and folks that basically run the nuclear reactors. While they're typically enlisted, they're coming through with a bachelor's degree, and when they come out, they're touted as being marketable ultimately for, running private sector nuclear reactors and things like that. So that was the long game, going through that pipeline and taking that test was potentially to have a six-figure career, right, coming out that most folks don't have out of the gate coming out of the enlisted pipeline typically.
Now, I've heard of men and women taking the ASVAB just through, high school. They had the opportunity. But was there something specific about your school that had a connection with the Navy and taking this specific test? Because I've never heard of that. Oh,
well, actually, looking back, that is a Navy junior ROTC program. So that could be why they did that at that particular school. At that time, the Clark County School District, which is it's now the fifth largest school district in the country, because they've never broken it up, really did not have what they refer to now as magnet schools, where they would have specific types of things that they would have at a particular school. For example, Rancho High School, which was El Dorado High School's arch rival at the time. They're still rivals, but everything's aged. Is a aviation and health medicine type magnet school now, and so and there are other ones that have IT magnet programs. Some were more vocational and things like that, and so they built those over time. But that wasn't in existence in the mid to late 80s when that came about. So I suspect, although I don't know, that because of the connect through the Navy ROTC program that they have still in place there, that's probably how somebody managed to just kind of shove that into the physics program, because you only got like 20 or 30 people taking that test.
So was there an actual time coming towards your graduation from high school where you made the conscious decision not to go in the military, or was going in the military just never kind of got to that point?
The closest for me that it got was having the recruiters in the living room trying to talk me into that program, and so
giving them credit though, they were honest and said if you wash out, you're going to be swabbing decks.
Oh yeah, yep, and I think I had gone down to the recruiters and at their offices, which were then on Sahara, not too far from here. They've moved since then to nicer parts of town as the city's evolved, and spoke with them, and I just kind of, my thought process at the time was I was going to go to community college here in town, transfer to UNLV, and then see if I could get into law school and go to become a lawyer. And so that was my very half-baked plan at the time, at the tender age of 18. So that's kind of how that worked out.
So how does law enforcement come into it?
So as I was going to college and working, I was working in a retailer that would probably be similar now to Kohl's. It was Mervyn's, actually, at the time. And I ended up, it was my first real job aside from mowing lawns and having that kind of thing, growing up as a kid, and right about the time I finished high school, they talked to me about moving over into their asset protection portion, which is loss prevention, I guess would be the term for most places. And I got plugged into running around catching shoplifters in plain clothes, right? So really cool job at the age of 18, right? Pseudo law enforcement, no weird uniform, a lot of autonomy. Moved around the valley to the different stores they had in the valley, and got exposed to surveillance and running into parking lots and catching shoplifters and putting handcuffs on them. Sometimes getting into fights, sometimes getting bit, and really kind of getting exposed to that side of life, which I hadn't been exposed to at that point in time. And like I said, everything's relative. I had absolutely zero concept at the time that how dangerous that is, right? And obviously most companies now have shifted away from doing those things, right? And you see that now in all over on social media and in the news, where people are just swarming in and taking whatever they want and leaving, and there's nobody there to stop them. And so the risk assessment for most private industry now is such that the juice isn't worth the squeeze, and they just don't have, folks out there running around and tackling people anymore and putting them in handcuffs because of the liability and risk. So, however, at that time, late 80s, early 90s, that was the way things were. And I got exposed to local law enforcement coming in for the people that we would catch shoplifting, and met a few of the police officers, and one of them offered to take me on a ride-along. So went on a ride along, 91, 92, came home, and, the bug had bit. And at that point, I made up my mind. I told my then fiance, now wife of 30 plus years, that, I know what I want to do, and I don't want to be a lawyer. I want to be a police officer. I want to join Metro. And so she was mad. And so we got past all that. I wasn't old enough to test at the time, so I had to continue where I was in order to make ends meet. I ended up getting promoted, put into like a training program for junior executives, and they made me a district investigator. And so I was running around out in order to promote, like in a lot of organizations, you had to be mobile, right? That's the code word for, we need to put you where we need you, as opposed to promoting you where you're at. And so they packed me up, moved me out to the Bay. I had a couple stores on the peninsula there, Redwood City, Millbrae, and San Francisco store at Geary and Masonic. And my peer group at the time was, 7, 8 years older than me minimum. I was...
You weren't even 21 at this point.
I was barely 21. In fact, I was finally old enough to take the test for the department. Back then, they'd wavered several times to where, at one point you didn't have to be 20, you just had to be 21 by the time you got sworn in at the end of the academy. And then they flip-flopped a few times policy-wise, where they changed, and, you had to be 21 at the time of hiring or testing. And so at that time, they also didn't test like every 6 weeks or every month like they do nowadays. It was so expensive and for them to test logistically that they would do it every year and a half, 2 years. They weren't hiring at the rates that they were now. It was a smaller agency, and so I took the test like summer of '92. The written test, I remember lining up not too far from here, down the street at the convention center at the time, off of Desert Inn, right around the corner from this hotel we're in right now, and there were 6,000 people lined up around the block at 5 o'clock in the morning to take the test, and so I took the test.
Those were the good old days.
Yeah, and took the test and packed up and moved. My wife and newborn son, who's now a 5-year veteran officer on the department. And we moved out to the Bay, and then we just waited for my number to slowly move on that conveyor belt towards the top, and got acclimated out in the Bay, got used to the new environment. So I was 21. I think I turned 22 shortly after getting out there, timing-wise, relative to when the test was. And all my peers that were out there working with me, different parts of the Bay, were, they're like in their late 20s, early 30s. So they had pop culture references that I didn't have, and it was kind of behind the power curve on some of that because of the difference in age, and then my number came up for LVMPD, and I packed everything back up and moved to Vegas, especially after realizing that cost of living out there was just prohibitive. We would never be able to afford to buy a house. If we stayed out there, we would be stuck renting, and whereas we would immediately be able to buy a house and have that lifestyle, raising a newborn son at the time, as soon as we moved back to Vegas, even with interest rates as high as they were at the time. I know everybody's freaking out right now because we're touching on 5% interest rate, but I reminded my wife that when we bought our first house, it was like 8.5%. And we thought we were getting a good deal at the time. So everything's relative.
Well, you left the Bay Area too early because it's completely affordable today.
Oh yeah, I've seen that. Mm-hmm.
So you came on to law enforcement in what year?
1994. I joined the department. It's finally when I came up. So I sat on that hiring list for a year and a half.
Was that common back then?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think they pulled 3 academies off the list at the time, and they ran a tick-tock cycle of spring and fall, based on the length of the academy, the logistics of setting everything up. So you had class 1 in 93, 2 in 93, 1 in 94, 2 in 94. So I came in 1 in 94, February of 1994, and joined the department, started the academy. By middle of October 1994, I was all by myself in the black and white. God help us all, and solo beat, and it finished up a few weeks later and went off to graveyard like most people.
So jumping forward a little bit, you ended up retiring as a captain.
I did.
When you first came on, was promoting as high as possible your goal, or did it kind of build through your career?
I would say that built through my career. Talking with different folks, I had a vague idea in the academy at some point that I might be a sergeant, right? And I figured at that time that I would wait 10 years, go a bunch of places before I tested and promoted, and that shifted. I ended up promoting to sergeant at about the 8-year mark. I did, probably 5 years in patrol, a little stint in vice. That really opened my eyes as to, asymmetrical law enforcement and, thinking outside the box. And I was a field training officer for a couple of years, training new guys, and then went to the gang unit, spent 3 years there as a detective. And then, what happens to a lot of us, I think, in that profession is a couple things. One is you have a keeping up with the Joneses mentality with your peer group as you're coming through the proverbial pipeline. And so you compare yourself consistently with your peers, and typically those that are, 1 to 2 years ahead of you, 1 to 2 years behind you, and then obviously those out of your own academy, because you see each other all the time. You're at the same station in life, so to speak. And so you're kind of comparing what types of assignments do they have, where have they been, what have they done. And then inevitably what happens is somebody that is within that group that you've got proximal access to tests and promotes, right? Or by the same token, they'll be the first one that leaves the nest, leaves patrol, and goes to a specialized unit. And then they're in narcotics. They show up. They've got a mullet, and a mustache, and a beard, and a take-home ride, with a surreptitious foot mic. You just tap it like the old high beam button on, with your left foot, and you're able to talk on the radio, and you're not holding a microphone up to your mouth, and so you get that gee whiz effect of new equipment.
Jump in right now. I'm sure there's probably some people young enough that have no idea what you're talking about hitting the high beam switch.
Right. That's actually, I didn't understand that at the time either until somebody who was a little older than me pointed, that's like a high beam switch. And like, what are you talking about? I didn't have that growing up. So even I was out of the loop on that until somebody clued me in. So you become enamored of, that the CDI factor of, cool new assignments, right? Chicks dig it. And so do cops. So it kind of covers both, ends of the spectrum, because we're equipment nerds and, constantly comparing, one another as to novelty, right? And so each type of assignment that we get, we hit new plateaus. And for anybody that works out, you do the same thing, right? You hit new plateaus. Man, I just want to be able to bench press 225. I want to be able to look cool at the gym and have 2 45-pound plates on there, because that's it. I'm in the club if I can hit that mark. and then I don't feel like an idiot around everybody else because I'm putting man level weight on there and I'm comfortable with it, right? With or without a spotter, right? And so the same thing happens within our careers where you begin to, make similar assessments and man, I can't wait. I just want to join the department. I want to wear the wool pants, have the boat anchor, Smith & Wesson 659 with the Border Patrol holster that they can snatch the gun out of you because they don't even give you a level 3 retention holster. And I want to drive a black and white and be all by myself in a patrol car, just like I saw those officers do when I went on my ride along. That's all I want to do. That's it, right? Until you get there. And then you're looking around and you're comparing yourself to your peer group and you realize this isn't all there is to have. You begin to get exposed to some of the specialized units that are out there within the profession. And we are constantly seeking more, right? And so, you go, oh, okay, I just want to be alone in the patrol car and graduate field training and all by myself. Next thing you know, you're on graveyard and 6 months later, you're barely staying awake at the end of the shift. And you're going, oh, I got to get the hell off a graveyard, right? And this is killing me. I got to get back to the land of the living. I need to go to swing shift. And, you get just enough seniority to make your transfer request in, get in there. And all of a sudden you're surrounded by heavy traffic, different types of calls because people are up and about and it's not 2:00 in the morning where you're all by yourself. And so then you see, somebody that leaves and goes off to vice or narcotics and you're like, oh my God, I got to get out of patrol. I'm being left behind. Right. And so there's that constant competition, I think, that comes with the profession. And I think part of it is the warrior culture, that ties in. There's a lot of similarities between law enforcement and any public service for that matter with the military in that respect. And so you're constantly seeking more, seeking new certifications, seeking new status, equipment, ability, new patch, new pin, ability to move around laterally and asymmetrically through the organization and experience the cool stuff, right? So what ended up happening is the first couple guys out of your cohort that's moving through that system is that personally finally take the test, get promoted, right? Now you're like, so what's it like over there, Mike? And they'll be like, oh, this is pretty cool, right? And it's the same analysis that we all do with, do I go to traffic? Do I go to vice? Do I want to, do I go to narcotics? Do I want to go to gangs? Because of what you perceive the unit to be, right? And then, of course, everybody's seen all the memes of, what you think the unit is, what the unit really is, what your mom thinks it is, but, so we go through those analysis as we, pick our career paths, regardless of whether, you're in law enforcement or military, and we begin drifting to the assignments that the folks that we work with that we respect and admire typically tend to go. So that, you see them in a certain light and you're like, I want to be seen in that light, and you follow, so you have a tendency to see groups moving through the system that typically had connects. They worked in a particular area of the department prior, and one person goes and then 3 follow, and then another 2 or 3 follow them. And if you pick apart any unit, you can typically find the connect, how that all worked out, that 6 degrees of separation in terms of self-selection for specialized units. So the same thing ends up happening as you begin making the assessment of, am I worthy or ready to take the leap and promote, right? Do I have anything to offer? Am I going to be that idiot that everybody hates because they promoted too early and they really have not enough technical knowledge to offer? They don't have that certain ability to be comfortable in their own skin and not have to flex all the time, point to the rank in order to get things done. And here's how I want you to do it because I've got these and you don't, right? And so you're constantly, if you're,
none of us have ever experienced
right, if you're
a leader whose rank is what their authority is,
right, and so you're. Most of us that are self-conscious, self-aware are kind of assessing that and determining whether am I really ready, and am I going to be comfortable doing that? Am I going to be part of the problem or part of the solution? And so, at that point, I end up taking the test and promote out, and you realize it's not all that complicated. That you know more than you think you do, and if you're comfortable and able to mentor people and not be intimidated by the next wave of talent that's coming up behind you, that inevitably you're going to run across folks that are better than you were, at the same stage, that you're not put off by that, then you're able to thrive. And so are they, right? And then it kind of solves itself because the talent will follow you because you make them feel comfortable as they're moving up through the pipeline, and it kind of solves itself. It's a self-licking ice cream cone, I guess. For us moving through our profession, if you've been in a specialized unit prior to promotion, the typical pathway is there's a typecasting effect that typically goes on. You see it in the military as well, where they have a more rapid return back to specialized unit as a supervisor or a commander because of typecasting. Similar to what goes on both in the military and literally from Hollywood, right? Well, why is that guy playing Superman now? Well, because he played Batman 3 years ago and it grossed $400 million, and we're comfortable. All we did was change the color of the tights, and we're comfortable seeing him in that way. And there's other people that you would immediately look at, and for right or wrong, draw a judgment based on their prior roles that they played, and go, there's no way that guy can credibly be Superman because he's been a comedian the whole time, right? So nobody takes him seriously, and so that plays out, as we move through our careers in terms of how folks get picked to go to certain types of assignments, and it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy a little bit, in terms of rinse and repeat, as you move through that. And then people are now you're in a leadership position, people are more and more likely now to see you in that type of role because you're doing it even more, right? And so if you don't squander the opportunity, you're typically setting yourself up for, bigger and better things. So then it becomes hey, have you ever thought about, maybe you want to promote to the next, rank? And so while I didn't have a plan coming on into the profession of going really beyond the rank of sergeant, which is for us first line supervisor, it ended up working out that I did. And some of that's timing. Some of that is based on, what mentors you got at any particular time that opened doors for you. And, so
when you got to the rank of captain, how many more positions between there and the top?
So the top for
is a sheriff, correct?
Yeah. So the top for the Metropolitan Police Department is sheriff. We're a hybrid agency that got put together legally in 1973 when they took the old Las Vegas Police Department, the city police, and they put it together with the Clark County Sheriff's Office. So they did kind of a bit of gerrymandering, I guess, with respect to what missions one would perform or the other. And there's some vestigial remnants of that decision that now manifests in the fact that the fire department has a bomb squad. Police department does not. They have something called armor, but they don't have the bomb squad. And so that's provoked some heated issues over the years in terms of who's playing in what sandbox. But that comes from a decision that was made in 1973 where search and rescue was given to the police department, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, and the bomb squad was given to the fire department, which in a lot of ways is almost a role reversal on both counts, right? Search and rescue is like cops performing fireman functions, and bomb squad is firemen performing cop functions. And so so the agency is headed by an elected sheriff. The sheriff of Clark County is the nominal head of the LVMPD, and they're elected every 4 years. They face the voters. And so while everybody that has held the elected position of sheriff since the inception of the LVMPD has been a member of either Clark County Sheriff's Office or the Las Vegas Police Department, or later on, everybody was a former member of the LVMPD. They're not technically members of the department. If they are a current member, they retire, and then they begin collecting their retirement, and now they are the elected sheriff of Clark County in a completely different system and paid under state statute limited pay. So they actually get paid, even though they're double dipping. I mean, they're getting paid more in reality. They're paid less than most of the people that work for them, just because of state statute setting the position for that, for the coroner and for the Clark County District Attorney, which is the triumvirate, right, of the only three guys that can arrest each other legally. So between that, we have an undersheriff, which is the highest ranking member of the department. And then you've got assistant sheriffs that have come and gone over the years as different sheriffs have come and gone and adjusted the org chart. For a while, one of the sheriffs got rid of the rank of assistant sheriff, and you just had deputy chiefs, and then you had the undersheriff, and then you had the sheriff. So that's shifted over the years. So everything above the rank of captain is appointed from the rank of captain to deputy chief, assistant sheriff, undersheriff. A lot of that is timing, relationships, and relative to when things are open, and then obviously the relationships between, because they are appointed by the sheriff to fill those positions. So for me, I ended up topping out at the rank of captain, and ultimately retired after almost 27 years.
My follow-up question was there an interest to keep going higher, or I don't like to use the word, were you satisfied with being a captain, but was that where you decided to stop?
So because that's an appointed position, that's the last tested for rank where you have a formal process by which you have direct control over the outcome, is up through the rank of captain. So you test for the rank of sergeant, same for lieutenant, and for captain. Beyond that, you don't have direct influence on whether you're promoted or not. That is completely at the discretion of the incumbent sheriff. So, like I said, some of that goes to timing and some intangibles in terms of whether or not you get plugged into those assignments. And then the same thing as far as your movement through the organization once you hit the rank of captain for this department is you move based on, you pretty much control your destiny as far as lateral movement up through the rank of lieutenant, because you self-select and go, I'm interested in that job, and slick down your eyebrows and jockey for the position. Whereas for captain, once you hit that rank, although you test for that rank and you knowingly and willfully go through the process in order to get promoted, because it's the highest civil service rank in the organization, you don't have any real control over where you're getting put, from that point on. So you're getting plugged into certain assignments based on typecasting, background, demeanor, temperament, timing, things like that. And so while you test for the rank, again, you move quite a bit, So I think the longest job I held as a captain was at 2 years, and I think the one behind that was just short of 2 years, and most of the other ones were 12 to 16 months, for each pop. So, and of course, for us, organizationally, captains don't get call-out pay, they don't get overtime, so you're kind of salaried even though you're hourly. It's kind of a weird hybrid spot.
Right. So I don't normally go deep into specific events in careers, but obviously the Route 91 shooting was such a large scale event where, and I've said this before, other people who have been in first responder roles have obviously been in large scale incidents, but probably very few to that level. What was your experience with it?
So that night, as I'm sure most people are aware, there's a lot of folks that were at the event because you had a lot of folks from California here for the concert. So they were here, a lot of military, a lot of first responders from out of state that were there attending the event as guests. So there's a lot of experiences for folks that were there, and they were looking at it through that dual lens of what they're trained to do, coupled with being in the middle of it and being victims and being shot at, even if they weren't hit. They probably know people that were, or saw people that were struck by the gunfire. And then they were also in a unique position because of their hardwiring internally to help people in their day jobs. They were extremely frustrated and disappointed because they were away from their equipment, away from their comms, away from the ability to do what they knew how to do. And so a lot of them just acted on instinct and responded the way they could. And, some rendered immediate aid, took people to seek cover, got people out of the cone of fire and got people away from the danger as best they could, even though they didn't have all their toys and equipment and ability to call in resources where they knew that they were needed. So it's an extraordinarily frustrating event, for a lot of the people there, just due to the number of people there in the cross-section of society that responded. So for me, that night, I was actually the commander of the SWAT team. That was my billet within the organization at the time, and I think I'd been there for maybe 6 months. I'd been plugged into that position. I had just selected 2 new lieutenants and were training them up as the tactical commander and one as the backup commander for that. They'd been in position for maybe 2 weeks because of some organizational issues that we were experiencing at the time. And so I ended up responding. I've taught this class around the country a few times because the inadvertent side effect of the scope and complexity of that event was such that everybody in the country and around the world wanted to know more about it. So the department ended up basically exporting speakers all over the place with their giant PowerPoint presentation comprising of video and audio and a lot of other things to discuss to different organizations and groups what happened and why, things for them to think about if they get exposed to a similar thing. And then, of course, each group that you present to has a different particular interest, right? So you might have folks that are looking at it from the 30,000 foot level in terms of, how to plan for such an event and have tabletops and deal with things like, where the ambulances are and how you stage and triage large-scale mass casualty incidents. So you're looking at it from the perspective of both the doctors and nurses and first responders and people driving the ambulances, as well as how the police interact with that and with the fire department, as opposed to you make a presentation to say, 3,000 SWAT cops in Ohio at their the big Ohio Tactical Conference. And, of course, they're all suffering from artificial lat syndrome, right, where they're all walking around with their lats all swole out and their arms akimbo as they get up to go get a drink of water from the presentation. For anybody who's been around a lot of tactical folks, and they're looking at it very much from the standpoint of ballistics and weapons selection and what type of explosive breaching charge did you use to get into the room? Are you using a tamp charge? Are you using a full-on the most powerful possible breaching charge you can to get into the room, and so a lot of different in the weeds type of technical issues. But so that night I was sitting at home getting ready to watch the last episode of the Vietnam War thing on PBS by Ken Burns when they did that, and I got a phone call from one of the canine sergeants who I knew for quite a period of time, called me directly and was telling me that they had an active shooter that they were working. He was en route to the call. At the time, he hadn't arrived at the Route 91 Harvest Festival. And for the life of me, even though I had in the job prior had been the commander of all the cops on the strip before I moved over to SWAT, I did not have a clue what he was talking about when he said Route 91. Then he said Mandalay Bay. I was like, okay, I know where Mandalay Bay is.
I would have to imagine for you at that time, there are so many events going on up and down the strip on any given day. This one probably didn't initially hit any type of higher radar than any other event.
Oh, no, not at all. So are we talking about the concert?
Yeah.
Okay, so the concert is no big deal, right? So the concert itself is, You're absolutely right with respect to that. So notwithstanding the shooting, the special event, and we have a unit within the department that is called special events, and they staff all of these concerts and events that occur up and down all throughout the valley, but primarily on the Las Vegas Strip at the different venues with officers working overtime. So they're in full Metro uniforms. They're working overtime. The overtime is paid for by the sponsor of the event. They pay the department, and the department then pays through normal payroll to the officers. And so they're able to keep control over staffing, moonlighting, and things like that, and able to ensure that department policies are adhered to, that you've got a certain professional standard. You don't have people, officers just kind of on their own moonlighting and wearing the uniform, right? So there's command and control. You've got supervisors there based on how many officers are there is going to trigger the need to have a sergeant. How many sergeants are there is going to trigger the need to have a lieutenant. How many lieutenants are at a particular event, triggers the need sometimes for a captain because of the span of control. So, for example, Electric Daisy, which is typically held in the north part of the valley at the Las Vegas Speedway in the summer, that is so enormous because you've got 150 to 200,000 attendees. That one triggers the need for a captain on each shift because it's around the clock for 3 days. And the amount of officers that are coming and going and having to staff that is it's enormous, right? So you're basically staffing police resources almost for a small town, 150,000 people there. And of course, they're all there to get high, listen to loud music and chase the opposite sex around typically. So that, you get all of the drama of a giant bar setting. And so the amount of folks there is enormous. This event
from my neck of the woods, I'm going to equate that to Coachella and Stagecoach.
Yeah. Yeah. So this event, it's 20,000, it's one concert.
Yeah.
We get that every night on the Strip because it's an event-driven economy. It's the Las Vegas Valley has changed, over the past 20, 30 years now to where it's an event-driven economy. For those of you that don't know, gaming probably only comprises 1/4 to 1/3 of the revenue for the Strip. Gaming isn't a thing anymore. It's not the thing. It's just a thing. And so the entertainment piece, the nightclubs rake in more money than gaming does. Why? Because they've pretty much legalized gaming throughout the country, right? So what makes it special is going to be the experience, right? How many celebrities are in town, now getting sporting events here now with the NFL in town. We're hosting the draft here this weekend. So you got an NFL team in town. You've got Major League Baseball looking at moving here to from the Bay as well, and circling around, looking to land now that they've seen what the Raiders have done and what they're able to extract from the economy as well as turn it over and give. And so, in the big scheme of things, this concert, it wasn't a thing. It's just one. Every night there's some event going on. And so, from my perspective that night, you're like, okay, it's not that big a deal because every night there's a concert. That just happened to be there for a multi-day event. It was a country music festival. So nobody was really expecting any real issues. Expected people to come and enjoy the music and leave and pump that money into the economy. It wasn't quite like what we do when that Electric Daisy Festival comes and we have, tabletops and, multiple moving parts where we'll have crisis rehearsal on things just because of the amount of people that are expected there and the location and moving logistics around the chessboard in order to react to that. So for this, it was another quote unquote routine special event. And so since it wasn't tied to a particular location, when they use the term, it's still attached to it, Route 91 Harvest Festival, it meant nothing to me, at that initial outset of the phone call. So as soon as that sergeant, expressed, the hotel that it's connected to, I was able to immediately visualize, okay, where that's at. It's going to be next to the airport. So I run downstairs, turn on my radio, and start making notifications to, as I assess what's going on. Listening to the radio, it was it was like listening to the War of the Worlds. You could hear gunfire in the background, stressed out police officers. It was nothing I'd ever heard in my entire career. And I'd seen a few things up to that point in time. And so, you begin to assess what the scope of the incident was. And at this point, I figured that there's really no reason to hold anything back. So, part of my role at the time was, because of the size of the department, the mission load, mission count each year, and workload for LVMPD SWAT, part of the billet is that you're kind of the regional SWAT commander. So you're coordinating with some of the smaller teams in the valley that don't have full-time teams, or they don't have quite, the mission count. And so I ended up calling FBI SWAT Commander, Henderson SWAT Commander, and North Las Vegas SWAT Commander that we've got relationships with, and telling them, here's what we've got. Here's the best available info right now. Keep in mind, this is fog of war. Everything is very much in flux right now. And told them, begin heading that way and start paying attention to the radio, and keep in mind that, we've already got police cars that are getting shot at. So as officers are getting close in their unmarked SWAT rides, they might want to consider how much they want to keep those emergency lights going, because they could draw fire from wherever this person is. We had not identified where the shooter was at. It was a very fluid situation. So, I remember as I was heading to the event, as I'm leaving my driveway after making all those phone calls, that, one of the nuggets of information that had floated out as you're listening to the radio was people were running across the runway at then McCarran, now Reed International Airport. And you're thinking, oh, well, does that mean that the airport's being attacked? Are they running across the airport with runways with AK-47s? And, is this a Mumbai-style multi-pronged attack like they did there, where they're hitting all over the city and confusing the response and bringing grenades and fully automatic weapons, or what, right? Because you can hear live on the radio what sounded like automatic gunfire. Notwithstanding the differences between a bump stock and a fully automatic weapon, I don't think it's academic at that point, because you get a lot of rounds are coming down from a high position on civilians and law enforcement at the time. So, as far as we were concerned, the guy had an M249 saw, right? And so, and we had multiple shooters, right? Because we were getting multiple calls from multiple locations with information that people had been shot. And afterwards, we were able to piece that together of why, and it makes sense. But at the time, you felt like we were getting attacked all over the Las Vegas Strip at the time. And the reason why is because when the gunfire first erupted, people began running in all directions just to avoid getting shot, right? Seeing people leaning on the ground with gunshot wounds, some people with head wounds, blood everywhere, people crying, and then just nonstop gunfire, right? So it was just, and then you're talking about that cross-section of society where not everybody has been exposed to things like that to where you can think clearly under such circumstances. So you've got a mix of people that have the training trying to help the folks that don't have the training. And, that's a lot of energy to expend in order to try to bring order to chaos. And so that fog of war wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. So as folks left, you had everybody carries a phone in their pocket, sometimes two, everywhere they go, and we live stream everything, and Facebook Live and Instagram this and that, text everybody. You're able to call your friend and do stuff right out of the Jetsons and see each other live on the phone, just on a one-to-one call, as opposed to broadcasting on multiple avenues of social media now. So what all that did, though, was it ate up a lot of bandwidth, right? So you've got 20,000 people simultaneously trying to use their lifeline to the police, call 911 simultaneously, call loved ones, tell them where they're at, try to coordinate where their spouses were under stress because now they're separated as the crowd panics and runs in all directions. It ate up all that bandwidth. And so what happened is as people began to leave the immediate area of danger, and they would finally, they run, half a mile, quarter mile up the road to corner of Tropicana, Las Vegas Boulevard. By the time they got a signal, the 911 call comes in, and they're standing, and keep in mind, they're from out of town. 911, can I help you? I've been shot. My friend's been shot. And where are you at? And they look up, and they're standing in front of the Statue of Liberty at New York. I'm in New York, and we've been shot. Call taker immediately types it in, and we've got a shots fired situation with 2 shot at New York. Officers are heading there, right? And so same thing, Tropicana, MGM, Excalibur, Bellagio, people would get far enough away, make the call, and they'd be in there. Or you'd have officers working a separate special event, for example, at the Tropicana, which is, catty corner from the New York at the corner of Tropicana, Las Vegas Boulevard. And they're inside the hotel. They're on a different channel because they're working a different special event. And it hasn't erupted wide enough now to where they're aware that, hey, they've got something going on the other special events channel where people are getting shot at, and they're inside so they can't hear it. And they see people now coming through the back of the Tropicana on the ground floor, and they've got gunshot wounds, right? And they're saying we've been shot, and immediately they're calling it out on the local radio channel for the Strip and saying, hey, we've got people shot at the Tropicana. Right. And this comes from officers now, so there's unfiltered. It's not getting broadcast by dispatch, and we have a tendency as law enforcement to immediately take that a lot more seriously than what gets broadcast, because we typically find early in our career that half of the calls are, maybe 30% accurate, of what the first version of an event coming in isn't. And so now we got officers saying, hey, we've got shots fired and people are shot. So now we've got this location is now an incident. So that's just a tiny snapshot. It's hard to adequately convey what that really looked and sounded like that night without using the PowerPoint presentation, because in that one, there's one particular slide usually opens eyes, when you go around the country to present that, and it gives the actual audio of each of those calls as they're coming in. We've got explosions and fire at the 33rd floor of New York. We've got hostages been taken. These are the calls that were coming in. So it sounded like literally a multi-pronged attack going on when it was happening live. And a lot of folks don't have an appreciation for that until you actually hear the radio traffic, because obviously for anybody that's ever dealt with the media can only hold its attention on one particular topic for, a finite period of time, and they generally are skimming the surface on whatever the topic is. For anybody that is specifically in the know on a particular incident that you've handled, you quickly realize that, they simply don't have the bandwidth and the capacity to be able to adequately analyze. For anybody that's got a true depth of knowledge of a particular, piece of responsibility within society, whether that is in the military, law enforcement, doctors, dealing with a particular issue, just skimming the surface, right? And we in law enforcement have a tendency to pick things apart when we look at anything presented by the media, without exception. We're like, usually with our spouse going, that's fake, that doesn't happen, and we never do that, and that's baloney, that's the wrong gun, you name it. And so until you're able to present that, in that context, it's hard for folks to be able to absorb, just how multi-pronged that incident was as it developed. So back to my response as I'm coming to, leaving my driveway as I've made these notifications and just kind of started those wheels in motion, because keep in mind, this is a Sunday night at about 10 o'clock, right? Everybody's sitting home in bed. It's not a Saturday night. It's not a Friday night. Really no major things going on. It's not New Year's Eve where we're all amped up and everybody's deployed. It's a Sunday night, right? And so as I'm listening to the radio traffic about the people running across the runway at McCarran, I'm like, okay.
Did they actually breach the perimeter?
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, thousands pouring over the fence line, and so. And of course, I'm envisioning, the early '90s terrorists running across with AK-47s. You pick whatever movie, and so So now I'm like, okay, how do I get from fog of war to something realistic to be able to determine whether I have to send resources there and commit something to that? And if so, what do I send, right? So, at that time, we've got a substation at the airport. We still do. And there's officers that are assigned there specifically around the clock, and it's smaller than a typical substation, but they're there and they know their way around. They know where all the gates are. They know how to get places, whereas the rest of us are kind of like fish out of water in that environment because it's just so many moving parts there. So I switched over to the airport channel, come up on the radio and ask. I'm like going, I don't want to talk to a dispatcher. I'm like, what officers are there looking at what just got described? And tell me what you got. Do we have people fleeing from the area that's being shot at? Because now, I managed to pull up a map. I'm looking at where the venue is relative to the airport. It's right on the perimeter fence line, right near it. And there's a possibility we could have people just, escaping and running in there. Do we have bad guys mixed in there? Are they just victims? What do you got? And officer comes up on the air. They're super calm. And cuts right to the chase and says, we've got them all herded into a hangar. They look like they're all victims. Some have gunshot wounds. It looks like they came over the fence line. Some are all scraped up from the concertina wire and stuff that's over the top there to keep people from going over the fence. But it doesn't take into account a mass of humanity that large and that committed to escaping something worse. And willing to cut themselves up in order to get away from, people getting shot and dropping like flies all around them. So the officer was able to go, we've got them all corralled in a hangar. We're rendering aid. We've got no bad guys right now. And because my plan at that point was just to send an entire team in its, all together, either FBI SWAT or Henderson SWAT or North Las Vegas SWAT. Well, my guys were heading to Mandalay. And try to keep at least team cohesion because at least everybody knows each other's voices. They've got each other's comms. They got the same equipment, and they at least are used to working with each other in a small environment. So you've got the highest likelihood of success if you keep people together, with that amount of uncertainty already baked into the equation. So, my plan was I was probably going to send FBI SWAT out there and have them just kind of go as a group, and they can work their way through the problem. But as it turned out, we were able to now begin assessing how much of the information that's getting broadcast is bunk, and how much the information seems to be more and more accurate as time moves on, right? So one of the broadcasts that, I mentioned earlier was, we got an attack and hostages up inside the New York, right? So I get a phone call as I'm sending folks to that location at Mandalay, and people are starting to land, right? So it's willy-nilly depending on where they live in the valley, where they were when the call got broadcast, and they're landing with their F-350s and deploying and putting on all their gear and getting there as quickly as possible and orienting to the threat based on what they're seeing now, because now they're close enough to not just get it over the radio show and they're there to assess, what's actually going on. So I know that I've got officers and team leaders heading up into the tower now and hiking up, and I know they're hiking because the elevators have descended to the bottom and they're locked out, right? So they're hiking up with 100-pound of gear apiece and trying to make their way up to 32nd floor. And so now I know they're expending energy, right, to get to the fight, and I know that they need to have some energy left to deal with the fight once they land there, right? So now you're dealing with the realities of deployment and logistics and things like that. And I get a phone call from a ranking person on the department, and they're going, you need to send SWAT over to New York to deal with that thing. And I'm like, my guys are halfway up the tower. I'm not pulling them back down. How do I comply with what they're asking for and yet not comply with how they're asking for it, right? So, comply with the spirit of the request and at least satisfy the need to assuage that. And so, I come up on the air and ask for, okay, who is arrived but not in tower? I get a sergeant pops up on the air, and I'm like, grab 2 SWAT guys and the rest of them, whatever, a pickup team from patrol, and make your way over to New York and assess that. Because I was beginning to get a sense that the way those calls were beginning to roll in, I was getting a sense that what we ultimately turned out to be true, that we had people running in all directions, that was likely going to be a false call. I mean, it's an accurate one. You've got a person there that's saying, I'm physically here and I've been shot, but the problem is the interpretation coming back that the shooting's actually occurring there. And I was starting to get a sense after a few of those coming in and some of the other officers being right there as it's called in, and they're going, nobody's being shot at here, we're with the victim. And now you're starting to kind of sift through that as it's unfolding to be able to keep people on point to get them to that floor. So by the time we had folks that landed up on that floor, the shooting was done. I mean, the guy was done shooting, and we were making an assessment on how close we get to the door to put people into that fatal funnel. So we ended up popping the door, with an explosive breaching charge, popping into the next adjacent room with another explosive breaching charge, and the guy's laying there dead. And that was that. And so there was another little issue that arose as a result of that, where we had to make a determination of do we have multiple shooters still? Is this the only one? Do we have other people that are like leaving, getting on a plane, trying to get out of town, getting in a car? A normal crime scene, once something is static like that and reduced from tactical and dynamic to static and immobile, is you lock everything down, you wait for CSI to come there, take pictures and prints, and that takes forever, right, to get all those logistics there. Plus you're dealing with a live scene with a lot of people shot, a lot of people at different hospitals now, a lot of people dead, massive multi-pronged crime scene. So we're and there's far fewer crime scene investigator, the techs, right? The CSAs, crime scene analysts is what they are. It got renamed CSI after the show about them. But they're still crime scene analysts, right? So there's a finite number of them, maybe, 4 to 8 on any given night that are working versus, the amount of officers that are working. So they were going to be stretched thin. So we had to make a decision on how quickly do we elicit usable, actionable intel from this guy. So I talked with, a couple of my peers and some ranking folks. I'm like going, just so you know, this is what I'm getting ready to do, because we need to move this forward a lot faster to be able to pivot in multiple directions to advance the investigation. Otherwise, we're going to be sitting around here with, twiddling our thumbs, and we could lose opportunities to get other people into custody and ensure that we don't have other shooters. So they all agreed, and I'm coming up on the air and telling them, okay, this is what I want for the SWAT guys that are in the room. I want you to, as discreetly as reasonably possible, go through that guy's pockets, find ID. I want photos. I want photos of him. I want some basic photos of the room so that we can orient to what you're seeing up there. It's a long ways away from the command post. And we don't need to saturate that with more footprints walking through there. So we did the quick and dirty, right? Because everybody's got phones and cameras on those phones. And so I ended up pushing that information to my counterpart, who was running the Southern Nevada Counterterrorism Center, the Fusion Center, to that captain so that he could push to their folks, and they begin vetting both through open source as well as their connects to be able to determine, one, positively identify our shooter, right? Determine whether or not, do we have if you got a white guy or black guy there, does the ID match the person immediately? Does the ID match what the hotel has, right? Or do we have a completely different person in there that's not registered to the room, so we can begin determining what additional investigator resources we need to throw at this in order to deal with how many other people are involved, right? Who knew what, when, and that kind of thing. And so we took the photos, distributed those. We end up getting to push that information around. Folks begin acting on it, doing the investigative piece, and then you sit back and there's a lot of waiting to be done, right? And so we end up figuring out where the guy lived. The guy owned property up in Reno. The guy owned property up in Mesquite, Nevada. The guy had a house in the valley. We start figuring out, what hotels he stayed at. He's kind of a high roller. Was getting comped rooms here, left, right, and center, because the guy gambled, tens of thousands at a pop per night. and you start getting a picture of, who you're looking at, where did he buy the guns, when did he buy them. So by the time the following morning hit and they kind of demobilized a few of the folks and we debriefed, and then a few of us caught some hours of rest before having to come back to the deal with the long-term, investigative portion of it. I remember waking up the following morning and I get, the sheriff is doing a press conference, and one of the reporters is pointing out, "Oh, hey, are these the actual photos of inside the crime scene?" And I'm sitting there looking at the TV and then online, and I'm like, those are the same photos on my phone that got distributed from, the pictures they took inside there. I'm like, well, that's out of Pandora's box. And so, I come in that afternoon, and you've already got, a few folks within the department go, "Oh, we need to do it." Some of those SWAT guys, they took pictures against policy and they're distributing it. And I'm like, slow your roll. Let me just remind you, I'm like, you weren't there at the scene, because I don't know where you're at, but I talked with the highest ranking person on the department and the second highest ranking person on the department and a few other folks, and we all agreed this is what we're going to do. So these guys didn't just go rogue and take these photos. It was done with a purpose to advance the investigation. The problem is you got too many people touching it, and it's so easy to send that information around. All it takes is one person with a relationship with a reporter, or once it's on the internet, it's out, and there's no pulling it back. So we all discussed whether this was worth the risk in order to advance the investigation, because this is outside the scope of a normal traditional homicide scene. And 3 jobs before that, I was the homicide commander, right? And so I got a pretty good background in terms of assessing both the investigative as well as the tactical side in terms of what we got to do to advance and preserve the investigation. And so the risk was we'd be moving too slow and we'd be behind the power curve to be able to try to get other folks, any Confederates that are connected to this, that are also actors, in pocket quick enough to be able to interview them, squeeze them, grab additional evidence, that kind of a thing. And so it was a risk-reward type of analysis in terms of how quickly we could move the investigation. Unfortunate side effect was those photos are out there, and then you got every Tom, Dick, and Harry in the world now doing their own investigation based on just those photos. I think the guy might have, not cut his own throat, and I think the officers executed him, and you're just like, oh my God. So, you're in the realm of those. You're starting to deal with, the opening, the other piece, which is going to be the conspiracy theorists. There's more than one shooter. Shot and killed President Kennedy. That's still alive today. So, unfortunately, you can't have one without the other, and you just deal with the facts as you know them and move forward. But I can tell you that, it had a massive impact on the department. We lost an off-duty officer that was working that night, that was attending the concert. He wasn't there on duty. He wasn't, he was there for the concert. He got shot and died at one of the hospitals. Obviously we lost, another 58 folks that were visiting there that were shot and killed. And what everybody loses sight of a lot of times is we had over another 500 that were hit but didn't die, right? They were shot but didn't die. And then you had another 300 that were injured, trampling, going over the fence line into the airport in order to get away from it, and just hurt in multitude of ways as they're trying to escape the danger. And then you still had, 20,000 people that got shot at but didn't get hit, right? And so in any other, for those in the law enforcement profession, if you got 5 people that get shot at, right, and only one gets hit, that's still, 5 counts of attempt murder, right? And in any other, in reality, we had 20,000 counts of attempted murder, people getting shot at, right? There's no way to differentiate who, how close the bullet got to him but didn't hit him, and lived through this massive traumatic event. And then you had, setting that aside, you had all of the fire department personnel, the EMTs, and then the doctors and nurses at the hospitals that responded, from their perspective to this critical incident in their capacity. We have for LVMPD SWAT, you've got doctors, trauma doctors that volunteer to go on missions with our officers, right? And they are trained up tactically. They don't carry firearms, but they are there, one, to protect the officers in case we get a downed officer in a tactical critical incident because of the high likelihood of that occurring. And two, to be able to render aid immediately to anybody that we encounter and shoot, any victims that the bad guy shot. And then, of course, if we shoot the bad guy or the bad guy shoots himself, which happens a lot of times, they're able to render aid instantly and have a trauma doc right there, right? So they're embedded with that SWAT team. It's part of that response package. And, I spoke to our trauma doc. He responded to one of the hospitals here in town. And, it was like a MASH unit. It was like out of the movies for him. He was describing what happened, from his perspective in terms of trying to help hundreds of people that got shot. Because, the few that showed up, they're dead, right? There's nothing you can do. They're pronounced, they're moved aside, and they've got hallways, triaged with gunshot wound victims screaming and yelling and people trying to find their loved ones. And these folks doing what they trained all their lives to do, which is to render immediate, meaningful, professional medical care, not just you and I, tying a tourniquet on a guy's leg, which, that helps, right? But they're actually like doing all the stuff that they really know how to do, right? And you could tell he was getting emotional about it when I was talking to him, and I asked him point blank, and I was like, we had some time to ourselves to talk about it, and I asked him, I was like, would you have wanted to be anywhere else that night, but been in a position to arrive at the hospital and do that versus looking back afterwards and going, he's on vacation in Hawaii and missed the whole thing, right? And he couldn't do what his life's work is to help people in that type of environment, as chaotic and messy and soul discouraging as that is. It would have been more difficult to deal with having distance between him and the ability to do what he is trained to do, right? And he turned and he tell he had tears in his eyes. He's like, absolutely, that's exactly the way I would put it. And we had a lot more officers and folks that had difficulty dealing with it in the aftermath that were gone, right? They were out of town, and everybody remembers where they were at when that happened. If you're in the southwestern part of the United States at that particular time, if you're on vacation, and particularly if you're in law enforcement, or with the fire department or EMT, but if they weren't in a position to act, they had more difficulty coping with the aftermath of it than the folks that were there. And that's tough to convey to folks that are outside of the profession, but that's what we dealt with in the aftermath, and that's consistent with what we've seen over the years with respect to a lot of critical incidents. The ones that typically had more trouble coping afterward were, on average, the ones that couldn't, for some reason, respond. They were out of position, on vacation, out of town, dealing with some other crisis, and that's what that was one of the biggest takeaways that we had. We had folks that were self-deploying from home. They were off duty. Because they're hardwired to respond and help. And we had the same thing with doctors and nurses. They responded to the hospitals, self-deployed, didn't get called in. Nobody called them. They just knew where they needed to be and when they needed to be there. And part of one of the response protocols that we already had in place that had nothing to do with this incident was any type of mass casualty that occurred, like say you had a gang shooting and then all of the family relatives show up and they want to fight at the hospital type of thing. We had protocols in place where officers would show up and basically carve out a safe zone for ingress and egress for those doctors and nurses to be able to get in and out. So you had officers at the hospitals with rifles shortly thereafter. Between that and then protocols that they had set up previously as a result of the Mumbai incident where that created our MACTAC, multi-assault counterterrorism response team. So that was part of things that were already baked into the response, and so they had to assume that another attack would potentially come at the hospitals like it did at that time. So we wanted to protect, basically carve out a shell for the medical personnel to be able to operate comfortably and be able to turn their back on the perimeter and focus on patient care, right? And so a lot of preconceived notions about how, how some medical professionals would view law enforcement and vice versa, that occurs over time, got broken down completely as a result of the incident, right? So that's a positive outcome, even though, it's a horrific event, that those physicians and nurses and medical professionals were able to realize that, they were able to work in concert, that those officers were there with their best interests in mind, and that they were able to comfortably turn away from doors, right, and focus solely upon where they needed to be physically and psychologically in the moment to be able to deal with that patient care effectively, to render aid as they could to the survivors, right? And we probably saved a lot of lives as a result of that because they were able to focus on what was necessary. So that was one of the takeaways. And then the other piece is the firemen, the firefighters that went downrange. They violated all protocols that night that they had existing because they went into essentially hot zones because we didn't know how many other shooters were there. We had people on the ground. You had fog of war that initially caused officers to believe they were getting shot at from ground level inside the venue from multiple points and locations. And in reality, it was because the guy was shooting from an elevated position and the rounds were coming from all directions from their perspective. But the firefighters didn't know that, right? So they figured that we had other shooters in the venue. They had to go through, find other victims, get people out of their hiding places that they had hunkered down in. Some had been shot. They're bleeding out. And they went downrange with those officers, clearing corners and running walls and going into, from their perspective, high risk situation. Retrospect, it wasn't. The guy was dead. He's up in the hotel room. They didn't know that, right? So that has a tendency to bind people together. Any kind of shared risk brings people together in ways that you can't completely quantify. And so I can tell you that the fire station for the Strip, invited officers, to visit, afterwards to the nice cushy fire department Barca loungers that they like to, hang out in. And it really bound them together because of that shared risk, right? They saw it from that same lens of protect the public, protect their community. And it really changed a lot of things for the better with respect to that relationship between the, police and fire department. And, they're better for it as a result of that, despite the tragedy. And so it was, and then fast forwarding to now, there's still, for the next year to 2 years, it was just nonstop. The amount of requests that we had nationally and internationally to present, a recap of that event. And typically it's a 4-hour presentation to even just to touch on a lot of those different things. And even then, as a presenter, you're skewing the presentation to focus on certain portions more than others, depending on what your audience is, right? And so it's a lot to learn from, and obviously other critical incidents have happened around the country since then. And, they're in a similar position to be able to provide that to, make things better for the next set of emergency responders that are trying to piece that together. But it was a unique experience from, on the ground dealing with that response.
Now that you're retired, do you still get called to do presentations?
Oh, yeah, I do. Yep. I've got one out of Florida that came out of the blue, that another friend who's retired, who's now a police chief up in northwestern United States, he had some other things going on, so he referred them to me, right? So, that still goes on throughout there. And then, of course, all the other different things that we've, all of us have been exposed to over the years that, you're kind of in that social network of folks that typically gets called upon to kind of present, certain types of topics and even in retirement.
Rolling into the command post that night, when you finally breached the Strip, or what I would refer to as the downtown area, did it appear that the periphery of the Strip area knew something was going on, or did it kind of still seem like, it's just another normal Sunday night?
Oh, no. You could tell, anybody who's been on any kind of a chaotic large-scale event one, you got emergency vehicles all over the place, right? Parked in the middle of the street, willy-nilly, choking off arterial access to different things. So that was the immediate bird's eye view. You can see all those emergency vehicles everywhere. Ambulances, fire trucks, police cars, unmarked cars with lights going. I mean, it looks like a movie scene. And so the other piece was we had already developed a relationship with the security chiefs and heads of the casino. So we had a whole separate communications pathway into them simultaneously to where we basically send out one text and it goes to all of the critical partners, and they lock the doors to the casinos to keep like a flood of folks coming in and out of the casinos, and it really chokes off, it begins to control access to and from the strip. So that way you don't have potential extra shooters going in and out. They're able to begin isolating portions of the strip. And so that having been said, and I say this almost tongue in cheek, I mean, you still had the proverbial, 70-year-old lady stepping over, pools of blood with their bingo ticket to cash in, because, all of us have seen that over the years where some people are just oblivious to what's going on around them, right? Person's getting shot behind them at the, and getting robbed, and they're just plunking away at the video poker machine, and they're just in their own world. And so, gallows humor, I guess, but you had a couple of anecdotals like that, but in general, it was so large and so impactful, coupled with the fact that we leveraged that relationship with the security chiefs and VPs of security at all the major hotels up and down that strip, which I correlate to essentially like a coral reef, because it's a three-dimensional concrete canyon, really, right? It's a unique environment compared to the rest of Las Vegas, which is akin to Los Angeles, very flat and wide and car-centric. That is a pedestrian-centric, vertical area, 6 square miles, that comprises the bulk of the economic activity, the economic engine for the entire state of Nevada, right? So it's a unique environment. A lot of people, a lot of money flowing through there, a lot of interest on many levels going through there. And so, prior to all that occurring, we had already developed mechanisms to disseminate information in a timely manner, two-way communication, quick two-way communication to the decision makers that could move, 1,000 casino workers at different strata within the organization to be able to, shut down or lock down or repivot within, one of those properties, which is like a small city unto itself. You might have one hotel with 5,000 hotel rooms, right? Times two for, how many people are staying. I'm assuming it's just, 2 people, and some people are doing, far larger than that. The staff to visit, everybody who's in the casino, on and on and on. Anybody who's at the venue for, say, a concert, behind the MGM at the Grand Garden, you got another 16,000 people inside of there, or a UFC event, same thing. So each one of those casinos is, like I said, a town unto itself, and you're dealing with, the amount of folks that are there that they have to manage through, and there's just not enough firefighters, not enough police officers to be able to deal effectively with that. So the force multiplier in reality for this community is the relationship with the casinos. A lot of them are retired law enforcement, retired FBI, that are heads of these organizations, so they get it, and then you're working through them in order to get things done, right? And leveraging relationships because you've had coffee with them and been out and had lunch and come to meetings, and you get these regular interactions on a monthly level to where, relationships mean everything, because, you got to face them again after, something does or does not go right. And it has a tendency to increase performance. And so it paid dividends that night, their ability to control ingress and egress to the strip, to facilitate both the investigation as well as maximize protection for the people visiting the community. And, so that was a big positive takeaway ultimately from that. But that was due to, a couple of years worth of groundwork where law enforcement stopped hoarding all information and, this is ours and you're not a cop and you don't get to know. it changed to where it was truly a partnership, both in terms of, day-to-day interaction as well as how information flows. And as you know, information's power, right? You make the best decisions with the most amount of reasonable information, as long as it's not classified. And so that's the platform which we were operating from at that time, and it continues now. So it's the only way that they're going to be able to maintain control as the Strip and Southern Nevada continues to grow, because there's just never going to be enough police officers and formal emergency responders to be able to do that. And so you have to have that private-public partnership in order to do it.
So using the relationship comment as a segue, you retired what year?
End of 2020.
And how soon did you start preparing for your transition out?
So looking back, I realize, and speaking to friends and colleagues, a lot of us that are now retired, came again from that same cohort as we moved through the organization, hit certain milestones. Looking back, there was a push by the department for formal education. Part of that was because there was always that issue of, they want more formal education in law enforcement and public safety. And of course, when we came on, there really was no requirement for it for us. I know a lot of like Los Angeles, LA County Sheriff's Office, and some of those agencies they've had requirements for quite some time. I remember when I talked to a guy out in Redwood City that while I was waiting to get hired, I remember that, their requirement at that time was entry-level officer had to have a bachelor's degree. And that's in 1993, 1992. So, Metro didn't have that. So what they did in like 2005 to 2017, they phased in a 12-year plan where they required, 60 credits or an associate's degree for the rank of lieutenant, and then they slowly phased in a full bachelor's degree requirement just to test for captain. And as a result of that, a lot of us that were coming through the pipeline in order to remain relevant and able to take the test, because we didn't know how many times we were going to have to take it, started going through the formal education. The thing that was also going on at the same time nationally was the push and the move towards online education, right? So before you had to, go and sit down in a class, find time in your schedule. One, find a class that's available that matches your schedule. Two, one that's open that matches your schedule. And then three, put your behind in the seat and show up, between the hour, of 6:15 p.m. to 9 o'clock to grind out your classes, right? And so that was the old model under the brick and mortar. And so a few of us were doing that. I was too, but it took forever because I had a full-time career job. And, the other side effect of it was, I would find that, I'm in my mid 30s at the time, going through, college. So I'm sitting next to, kids in class that are 18, 19 years old, and they're, I feel like I parachuted behind enemy lines, and they're like, I think we should give all our money to the communists, and you're just like, what? And so you feel like an outsider, right? And so your life experience is different. You're in a certain profession, a certain perspective, because you're used to giving all your money away in taxes, and so you become a little different, as you approach middle age. And so yeah, that as a hurdle. So as word of mouth started to get out and certain colleges started to open their doors to online education, again, you go back to that word of mouth and we follow each other. Oh, where are you going? Are you going online? Oh, University of San Diego. Oh, that's good. How do they structure their classes? And it became almost a professional arms race amongst friendly competitors as we're trying to remain eligible to test and promote, right? And you want to keep up with your buddies. So the formal education piece began to get rolled in, and we inadvertently made ourselves extremely marketable externally for life afterwards, right? And so, what I've found is having participated and helped in different promotional opportunities in other cities and states, because the game in law enforcement and public safety is they have assessment centers in order to promote, right? And so they always call in outside raters and trade them, right? So, the Los Angeles Police Department will have members from LVMPD come down there to be, what I euphemistically call the East German judge. So you had somebody that doesn't have a relationship to any of the candidates, doesn't know them, and is just an impartial part of the process. So it isn't the good old boys network all the time in it. So it gets it around that in order to provide for civil service protected promotions, right? So having been to other cities to do that and be the outside raider a few times, and having talked to a few of them when they would come to the Valley to perform that function for Metro, you realize that the most other organizations, the HR function or the HR folks, if it's a city or a county organization, most of the HR function is dispatched to that city or county, and it isn't part of the police department. So they become the gatekeepers for the organization. And, what I found in talking to a lot of them is those gatekeepers have a tendency to put a disproportionate amount of value on formal education, which is okay, right? It's cool. But we have a tendency within our world of what we do, where we value what's on our resume, the places we've gone within the profession, we value far greater than, where you've been and what you've done, is of more value in terms of me assessing or us assessing one another's value to the profession, right? What'd you do? What's the degree of difficulty that you went through in order to get to where you're at right now, because those typically make for folks that make better decisions. At least that's how we tend to interpret that. And so,
for the most part, when we leave this profession and go to the private side or step away from law enforcement, police officer on your resume kind of covers it all.
Correct. However, for those of us in the profession, it's where did you work?
Yes.
What assignment did you work? Because we look at one another and we're like going, yeah, I got one of those too. Yeah, I got a badge. I did it for 20 some odd years. But where did you work? What did you do? What types of assignments did you have that stretched you, that makes you think three-dimensionally and asymmetrically, as opposed to, you think back to when we start the profession and we're all equally stupid, right? And, we come out of the academy, we barely know how to put the gun belt on. It matches up our gig line, and we look really good in the uniform because we have youth and fitness on our side at that time, full head of hair. But we're, if we're
in the room right now, one of us still has a full head of hair.
But it's thinning. It's thinning. So anyway, so I'll leave it at that. But you look back, if we're honest with ourselves, as we think back to some of the things we said and did earlier in our careers in law enforcement, and we're much more robotic typically, in terms of interacting with the public. We don't come up with as many solutions because it's not all in the policy manual. It's not black and white. The only thing that's black and white, depending on your agency, is the car. And so you become a lot more fluid in terms of, one, how you interact with people, your ability to inject humor and humanity to dealing with people at their worst. And then, of course, the ability to go home safe, which is pretty much all you carry out of the academy on the front end, unless you've got some prior life experience before becoming a police officer in a couple other professions that kind of rounds you out. But the reality is most of those entry-level cops are, early to mid-20s, maybe late 20s. And, you're standing there. I remember a class where, he's now retired, long retired from the department. In fact, his daughter is a captain on the agency now. Would stand up and do the 60-40 split where your gun belt, the gun side is away from the person, 60% of your weight is on the back foot, and you're staying in that particular stance that they're trying to teach you in order to be safe in case you get attacked, right? Pardon me, sir, but do you know what aisle the peas are on, right? Like you're in a grocery store and you realize how robotic your interactions and response are at that time versus, later in your career at that 10, 15 year mark. And you see it to some degree, even in field training, where the public can instantly diagnose you're the new guy, who the field training officer is. They're both standing next to each other. And even if you're not wearing a uniform with your hash marks displayed and it's all otherwise identical, demeanor and temperament, bedside manner, or carside manner for cops, is immediately relevant and instantly identifiable by any member of the public, and they gravitate to talking to the one that looks like they have it together, right? And so the transformation that occurs, is a direct result of one, how many years you've gone on and where you've been, right? And so somebody told me this one. I didn't come up with this myself, but I've repeated it a lot of times. There's a big difference between a 25-year cop and a 1-year cop 25 times over, right? So we've got folks that sometimes we've gone through the organization. They came on with us, but they plateaued at about the 1-year mark and never learned another thing. And they just did the bare minimum, as they moved through their careers, and they really never grew. They're not learning how to do T3 wiretaps. They're not learning how to do search warrants and arrest warrants and deal with CIs and complicated portions of law enforcement to begin to, allow you to do things that are well outside the scope of what a basic street cop does. And some of them are just perfectly happy with that. But as far as peer relevance and how we regard one another and kind of assign value to one another to some degree, it's where have you been and what have you done, right? And so that resume, and most of us, because we come through the same organizations, know each other's resume because we grew up together within the organization, and we have a pretty good idea, what that person's all about. And in reality, even as you start hitting rank, your name is more important than the rank, right? The rank is incidental, allows you to move to a certain position within the organization because the billet is held by lieutenant or captain. And by you, going through the swimsuit competition and evening gown competition and everything in order to get promoted and going through all that rigmarole to get the formal rank assigned to you, all it's really doing is allowing you to basically be in a different spot on the chessboard. And so now as a knight, you can move 2 forward and 1 to the left, 2 forward and 1 to the right, or 1 forward and 2 to the right, because that's what knights are allowed to do. Bishop, diagonal all the way across the board. Rook, 90 degrees all the way across the board in either direction. And so all those ranks really afford you is those abilities to hold those positions, which now allow you to bring what you have to the table, right? But the reality is when you're standing there and you have both people of the same rank or status within the organization, we still do that basic assessment we did at the entry level where we're going, yeah, I've got a set of those bars too, and we're not doing that because that's stupid, and you know it, and then peer pressure begins to take hold with respect to how decisions get made. So again, you're back to the name's more important than the rank. Your name within the organization is your FICO score, right, of relevance and credibility, right, in terms of how you treat people, how you talk to them, whether you have any humanity left in you, or whether it's all about you or it's all about us. Right, and that all is tied to your name, which is coupled with that resume that you're carrying around with you, and so we value that, right? But the issue for us as we approach leaving the parent organization or the one that you spent the bulk of your time with and transitioning into a new role without all your hash marks on, is the ability to get through that door and into the room to be able to talk about that resume. Because if you can't get into the room, nobody hears your resume, right? So the key to getting into the room, my observation has been formal education gets you in the room, gets you past the gatekeepers, which are the HR folks, which assign a tremendous amount of value to formal education. As soon as if you've ever dealt with academia and folks who, as you partner with and do white papers and things like that in order to try to tie academia with, proven law enforcement techniques and tactics that the academic community buys into, which gives us a certain amount of relevant credibility to deal with the public, right? The reason why we came up with this plan is because, the folks that study this for a living bought off on it, signed off on it, and there's actual empirical data that supports use of new tactics and techniques to form law enforcement things. And so as you deal with folks in academia, you can see the reactions from them when you get introduced, and this guy's got he's got a bachelor's degree, he's got a master's degree, and so on and so forth. And while your real peer group that you grew up with knows just how stupid you still are, and mine still know how dumb I am, but when you
piece of paper doesn't mean anything.
It doesn't mean anything. But what it does do is it affords you the ability. It's equivalent to getting your commercial driver's license, and it legally authorizes you to get behind the wheel of a big rig. It doesn't say how good you drive it, right? But it says you meet the minimums, right? And so if you don't have that, you don't get behind the wheel at all, right? Which then now you don't get the experience that comes from being behind the wheel, and then it's an issue of chicken or the egg, which comes first, the experience or the relevance. So in this case, you get a knuckle dragger, police officer, which is, sometimes how, a good part of the world views law enforcement, gets introduced, and, you get your curriculum vitae put out there, and they're like, oh, this is the guy's background. He's got 20 some odd years on, so on and so forth. And all the stuff that the cops light up on, this guy worked SWAT, this guy worked this, he worked that, he's got a security clearance. But you watch the reactions of the academia folks when they go, oh, and he's got a associate's degree, bachelor's degree, and a master's degree from these universities that, everybody recognizes. And you instantly see them have the same reaction as the cops did on the resume side, right? And you're like, well, that's interesting, right? Now, all of a sudden, they're willing to talk to you because they don't perceive you as just this archetypal knuckle dragger that doesn't want to listen, and it just won't, me hit you, take to jail, right? And so it opens doors, and the same thing, as you get to getting past those gatekeepers, the HR folks, where they have that same reaction. Oh, you've got all this formal education. Well, now you get into that room, and the other people that have formal education of relatively low percentage have the resume piece, though. So now the resume piece is what sets you apart, right? Because you can talk about all this neat stuff that we have experienced, and especially irrelevant to law enforcement. It's all the stuff that typically people ask you at barbecues. Is it really true that you guys do this? You ever shot anybody? Have you ever blah, blah, and so you get all the folks that are outside of the profession that are asking you those questions. And of course, for us, usually it's the funny stories of all the silly things that occur that drive the storytelling for the cops. You don't get to talk about that unless you're in the room. Right. But that is ultimately what sets you aside as the more credible candidate, because you're able to think in ways that other people can't, bring that relevant experience to the table that other people can't, that gives you that gravitas and credibility walking into the room. There's certain folks that we all grew up with and saw. If they walked in the room right now, you'd just be in awe of them because of how you viewed them as you came up within the organization. And in those settings with the background that we've got, you're that guy, right? When you come into the organization with that kind of a relevant resume, right? But if you can't get in the room to talk about it, it doesn't matter, right? So, one is a means to the other, to an end with respect to, the formal education piece. And so that's what a lot of us have found as we've transitioned, as we've gotten towards the end, and all of a sudden all these job offers start pouring in, and it's because, you've got that formal education. And part of it is meeting halfway for the people, the decision makers that ultimately pick for those positions. And meeting halfway is you've got the formal education. So they don't have to sit there and explain to the folks that they answer to on the other side of the equation, well, why'd you pick that guy? Well, I picked that guy. Well, look at this. Wouldn't you pick him? Look at all this stuff on his resume, right? And so even in reality that, and you hit the nail on the head. I mean, a piece of paper doesn't make you any smarter, right? And it means you were able to follow through, you paid your money, and you probably write better and maybe speak a little better. Hopefully, if you did it the right way, you're able to put your thoughts together a little better, but that's about it. But the reality is what you truly bring to the table is what you did for a profession for, X number of decades. And but it helps those decision makers on the other side of the equation justify their picks, and they don't have to shed as much political capital to pick you. And, boy, I'm taking a chance here and picking Chris because he's, on paper, he's kind of an idiot. no, on paper, the guy's solid, right? And then whatever you know about the person and have developed some of the intangibles is also part of that selection process, but you're making it that much easier for them to be able to pick you, right? You're making yourself that much more, you dolled yourself up, you got the, you're shaved, and you're prepared, you look the part, but it helps get you through that door because you have done the legwork in order to know that, hey, this is a requirement. Instead of getting hung up on the fact, and we all have a tendency to do that, where we will avoid, having to go back to school and do some of those things because we know, it doesn't make you any smarter, right? What you do every day is what makes you good, a professional and proficient at what you do is the reps, right? The difference between an officer with a particular organization and another that got hired on about the same time is the types of calls that are going on and the amount of times that they go on it. So you take a doctor. They both graduated medical school, same school, roughly the same class rank. And this doctor goes to Dubuque, Iowa to run a clinic. This guy goes to Chicago Memorial and is dealing with gunshot wound victims all the time. Now you compare them 5 years later, this guy is massaging hearts, through an open wound and, hey, where do you want to go to lunch? And they're calm about it because they've done it so many times. And this person is setting broken bones, right? And so they plateaued at that lower level in terms of day-to-day proficiency doing some of the higher level techniques. And that goes back to what I was talking about on, the officer, the 1 year cop, 20 times over and the 20-year cop, right? And so there's a difference, and it's the same in the military. Where have you been and what have you done? You measure those two folks, although they've got the same formal education on paper, both have MDs. This is the guy you want, working on you when or your loved ones when they land in the ER, right? And the same thing goes for us. So as you're preparing for that transition, it's a lengthy, it's an almost, lifetime of learning, of taking advantage of different opportunities that your organization is going to send you to continue to prepare you along the way. It's not a big rush at the end to check certain boxes. It's a process by which you, remain marketable within your own profession during the bulk of that career, and still makes you that much more marketable as you get towards the end of that career and transition out, that you're also marketing towards those customers, so to speak, right? And those customers, that I'm referring to is those HR gatekeeper types that get you through the door to where you're able to make your background and training that is sometimes hyper-specialized into something that's broad-based and useful outside of the profession, right? And so, law enforcement, military typically are unique professions, but folks, as they get to the tail end of those careers and they're typically in the higher ranks, are typically making similar types of decisions in terms of executive level, high level functioning decisions with respect to taking into account human resources issues, personnel issues, personality issues, how to reach different people in different ways in order to elicit the maximum amount of work, right? But what's that look like, right? What is the fancy verbiage of I care, for LVMPD, integrity, courage, accountability, respect for people, and excellence, right? That looks cool on a poster. Well, what's that really look like in practice when you're like interacting with each other every day? How does that translate to in terms of human behavior and the things that typically drive loyalty and respect? Those are big words. What's that look like when you're actually doing it, right? And so typically by the time folks get to that stage of their careers, they could do that in their sleep, right? If they've had certain types of assignments and billets, and so they walk in, with their formal education and rank, but the reality is they're easygoing, comfortable in their own skin, immediately able to find relevant topics and points of interests that touch even into new communities, right? Where you're able to make whatever you do relevant in say you're dealing even with faith-based leaders, you're able to relevantly find anecdotal stories that touch into both areas that immediately resonate, with the audience, right? And now you've got them, and you're able to talk and move credibly. That's what it looks like in those environments, and that ultimately, for example, with the faith-based example I'm giving you is that, you walk into the room and they're walking up and giving you the bro hug as the, commander of that substation for the church, that church that happens to be in that area. They're benefiting from that relationship as much as you are. You're walking in, you've got credibility with their flock because the leader of that flock is walking up to you and giving you the bro hug and the good guy handshake, right? And same thing from the standpoint of them is they've now got additional credibility with their flock because they are interacting with a facet of government, right? A ranking facet of government that's got connects and able to get things done and demystifies that relationship piece that a lot of folks, there's typically a barrier between, the public and law enforcement, right? Because how we carry ourselves, the uniform, so on and so forth. So, all those things as you get to those stages and you've got, in the military, you've got, base commanders and, ranking folks that typically, they are meeting with the mayors of their communities, and they've got these outreach programs and things like that because they've been doing it for a long time. It's part of the culture. Law enforcement probably lags behind that to some degree. They've only been doing that for maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years, whereas anybody who's got any kind of a lengthy military background, and especially at those ranks and levels, they've been doing that for decades, right? And that's just part of the assignment, and so they become very adept at meeting with different groups and all walks of society in order to establish that interactive piece. And so anybody that's got that and is immediately able to establish that, even in the new setting where you're not a cop anymore, you're light years ahead of your peers typically, because the folks that you're coming into contact with as you walk out of the old profession and into the new one are typically early to mid-career. So they haven't made these discoveries that to you seem like no big deal because you didn't know either at that stage of your career, right? So you're now interacting, at that level as an ambassador from either the military or law enforcement in this new private public sector setting, and you stand out, right? Because you're able to quickly find that relevance between, your demeanor and temperament coupled with that formal education that got you through the door. And then in reality, the other piece that really lends your credibility is going to be your resume, where you've been, what you've done. But that the platform on which you're operating that got you through the door is going to be that formal education. But if you skip the legwork on doing those things, that basically, a lot of people are taking themselves out of the running to even get those opportunities as they transition out. And the other piece that I've found repeatedly as I've gotten closer to retirement and then finally, gone over to the other side in the last year and a half is a lot of folks that did not think about retirement and thought they would just retire and I just won't work. I'm going to fish and golf. There's only so much fishing and golfing and hobbies that you can do to fill your day because we are mission-centric creatures as adults. And to go from zero, go from 100 miles an hour to zero, that's tough. Or the other analogy would be, diving. If you go down 200 feet, you're supposed to decompress at certain stages before you pop to the surface or you get the bends. And the same goes, a lot of folks don't realize the amount of pressure that they're under in terms of, the peak of their primary careers before they pop to the surface like a cork. And if they don't have something working against that to keep, their muscles toned, then they have a tendency to kind of flounder a bit, and they don't have a mission. And I think everybody needs some sort of mission. Doesn't need to be quite as complicated or intense as, your primary career was, but you need to have something or you're going to drive your spouse bananas when you're home all the time. You're going to spend more money than you want. And you're not going to be able to plow all the relevant knowledge that you have forward to another generation, which is useful in and of itself if you're not interacting with people. And so a lot of people give that up if they don't have that plan, thinking towards the future, especially with that formal education and then any other opportunities they've got to be able to advance that professional education that you've got as you're within your career field.
Now, you ultimately transitioned to a private company that coordinates marshals, U.S. Marshals at federal courthouses, correct?
Correct. So it's a private. There's several private companies that work with the Marshal Service as contractors and they manage what they call the CSO program, which is the Court Security Officer program. All of those court security officers are deputized as Special Deputy United States Marshals. So they are sworn in, just like anybody who's ever managed or been a TFO, a task force officer. Those are all done under the auspices of the U.S. Marshal Service, because that by federal statute, they're the only ones that can deputize people. So even if you're a TFO on a FBI task force, and I supervised an FBI task force like 12, 14 years ago as a sergeant, and so I was a TFO, and on the top of the creds it says, Federal Bureau of Investigation, but on the bottom side of the creds it says, is a Special Deputy United States Marshal. And I went down to the same federal courthouse that my office is in and got sworn in. They took you in the conference room and they swear you in, do your thing, and then you fill out the actual deputation form. And that's the legal document that says, you're sworn in and you're cross-deputized as a federal agent, right? That's all under the Marshal Service, regardless of whether it's DEA, ATF, you name it. But it all ends up going back to the Marshal Service because they're the only ones that can dole that out. And then the sponsoring agency has them as a Special Deputy U.S. Marshal. Sometimes it is the Marshal Service for like a FIST team, Fugitive Task Force, or something like that. But a lot of times it's FBI, ATF, DEA.
But management is controlled by what I say civilian staff in relation to your position?
Correct. So I'm not deputized, and I don't perform any of those functions. So the rough equivalent as far as span of control, because it's like 73 positions here for Nevada, because it's Reno and Las Vegas. So there's 2 courthouses in each one, a bankruptcy court in each one, and then there's a district court in each one on the criminal side. So you're talking about 73 folks, which for Metro would be the equivalent of span of control of roughly a lieutenant, right? You're talking, maybe 2 lieutenants, because you're typically talking about 4 squads of 10 officers. So you're probably in the realm of like half a substation, like 2 lieutenants span of control. So whereas a captain at a station has 200 to 300 officers, right? So here I come in and I work for the company, right? The CSOs work for the company, but they're deputized and given their authority by the U.S. Marshal Service. And then each circuit has a different company that has the contract for the organization, right? So like for the 9th Circuit, which is fairly large, you're talking about the Centerra group, which is a subsidiary of Constellis, which also has the 2nd Circuit, which is the northeastern seaboard and around the tri-state area, New York City and all that. And then they just picked up the 5th Circuit, which is Texas, Louisiana, and I think there's one other state. And then there's a couple other companies that typically move in concert with them, like Walden Security and things like that. They have different circuits. So each circuit, for example, 9th Circuit has like 1,200 CSOs throughout there because it incorporates, obviously, California, Arizona, Oregon, Washington, Montana, Idaho, Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, Saipan. So quite a bit, across multiple time zones, just because of the nature of the 9th Circuit. And so, whereas the other ones are a little, they're just set up the same as the circuit courts. And so the money flows from the marshals to the company. The company pays for those CSOs, and then you've got management, basically running payroll, personnel, HR issues, bringing people on board, letting people go, when they resign or double retire. All of those guys almost invariably, they're all prior law enforcement. Most are double dipping. They're at the stage where they already have a full career behind them, and this is their downside. So they're basically, for lack of a better term, I call it TSA with guns, right? Because they're basically running metal detectors and x-ray machines at the courthouses. And if the courthouse is the analog to the airport, that's basically it. Anybody that goes through there is able to walk through the courts and interact with the courts and deal with that part of the criminal justice system and the government, and they just keep it safe. But in reality, they're not going to hot calls. They're not going on bank robberies. It's a pretty low-key retirement job, but they do have federal arrest authority if somebody, loses their mind and comes through the doors and presents a threat or, is just completely disruptive. They deal with that. But in reality, anybody who's been into a federal courthouse, it's a lot calmer than say you go to the local or the county courthouses. Those typically, I mean, they look like the cantina scene from Star Wars, right? In comparison to you walk into a federal courthouse and it was very staid and calm and quiet and much more orderly. So it's a different environment for those guys. And you're dealing with law enforcement culture, right? Where, anybody who is supervised or commanded officers, regardless of what agency, and we almost learn it in field training, as rookies, when you see the senior guys walk into the room, and you're sitting in the back watching everything unfold as, with no experience, and you're scared of your own shadow. And you got that pecking order. The senior guy comes sauntering into the room and goes, I don't think we're going to do that, Sarge. That's stupid, right? And the sergeant doesn't jump up and knock him down. They just laugh and, everybody kind of moves on. And you're sitting there going, wow, how do you get to be that guy, right? And so that kind of starts the path for a little bit of that culture, which is, you give a cop $10,000 and we're mad because it's all in hundreds. Dude, I gave you $10,000. And you're like, yeah, but it's all in hundreds, dude. You can't buy a burger with $100 bill. What are you, smoking crack? What's the matter with you? They're not going to take a $100 bill. I need 20s, 10s, and 5s. So you're dealing with that dissatisfaction default that kind of comes with us, right? And some people would get mad when they would deal with it, especially as they started to hit certain ranks where they don't listen to me. And I'm like, look, you don't get it both ways. If you're dealing with this culture, that same mentality is how they go home at night, because they look at things with a jaundiced eye and they don't take things at face value, right? And so for them to go home at night, make the best decisions, and see to it that when they leave work, they are leaving with the same amount of holes in their body that they started the shift with. This is kind of a side effect of that. And so you just have to take it as part of the package and not get wrapped around the axle dealing with that, and push through that when you're trying to make change or get people to do things. You're just going, yeah, I know, ha, ha, ha. And okay, that's great. I still need that hill taken by 2:00 Friday. And they were like, okay, because we're mission creatures, right? So knowing that and coming even into this new environment, they're all retired law enforcement. They all have that mentality that I'm hitting on right now. And so you take it as a matter of faith that that's going to occur, and you push past that. And so you're able to kind of come in with a certain demeanor and temperament, like you've, been in the end zone before, and not overthink things and still accomplish the mission, but you do it in a way that seems kind of easygoing, but still done with purpose, and keep those wheels going. So it's, I will tell you, compared to, my last job on the department, I went from juggling 2 chainsaws, a bowling ball, and a rattlesnake every day as the commander of the Fusion Center, Southern Nevada Counterterrorism Center. If you're dealing with the FBI, JTTF, threats, all over the place, classified information, you name it, everything was a crisis. To essentially absentmindedly juggling one fuzzy green tennis ball and sipping a vanilla latte as I look around and realize, wow, this is a different pace. And my wife commented, probably the first couple of weeks I retired and was in the new job, because I started the next day. I transitioned right in because we were in the middle of COVID. I was like, there's no place to visit. You got to wear a mask everywhere. I'm like, there's no point in having time off. I'll just roll right into the new job. My wife commented that, it was the first time in like 10 years that my phone didn't ring during dinner, and I didn't have 2 or 3 text feeds going on at the same time and managing multiple crises. The whole conversation, the entire dinner was just us. And we were still in town, because the only way for us to do that previously was we would have to leave town, be gone, literally be on vacation, and not have that phone. But prior, this was in town just right down the street, and there was absolutely no interruption. So, different lifestyle, different pace, in comparison to what I became accustomed to. And you don't realize how fast you're going until you get off that train, in terms of the tempo and pace of operations. And so, so for me, it was a good fit, right? You got 2 different things that somebody told me once, and you've got match, right? Which means you meet most of the requirements, but it might not be the proper fit, right? In terms of how a job, fits you in terms of your demeanor and temperament and what you're expecting out of it. So this was a pretty good fit, all things considered.
Are you involved in the hiring process of the CSOs?
I am. So I'm responsible for the hiring for all the CSO slots here in Nevada, and coordinating, doing all the paperwork to get folks on board as we do the interviews, work them through some of the disjointed processes that they've got at corporate. For example, they're wrestling with the issue that when you send your resume to the corporate website, how are their IT folks have it set up? Almost everybody gets a rejection notice and said, yeah, you're not qualified. So I'm getting, folks that I know that, this guy used to be the SWAT commander for the North Las Vegas Police Department, and they're, hey, I'm not qualified. I'm like, ignore that. To where they pipeline those resumes directly to me. Otherwise I'll never see them. And then we schedule the interviews. We have a pool of applicants. And then when we finally have openings, and I have to, unlike on the police department, when we have openings, I got to wait until you vacate your position and go, I'm done on such and such a date, and now I get to offer to this guy that's in the on the list, hey, are you still interested? And I know we interviewed like 6 months ago, and then I have to verify that they're still eligible, right? Because there's some rules where they have to have only been retired for about 4 years to be eligible under the way the Marshals set it up. You have to have a certain amount of experience relevant within a certain time frame to be eligible to have the position, and then put them into the pipeline, work them through that, and finally get them onboarded and through training, and then they'll ship them off to FLETC out there in eastern United States, where they send most of the other federal agencies for their training. And it's a week-long how to run the metal detectors and X-ray machine certification. They come back and do their thing. So it's and then, of course, you're dealing with the normal payroll issues and stuff that I used to be able to. Other people handled that. I didn't have to handle that as a captain on the agency, right? Because elves handled that. Well, I'm the elf now, right? So I'm the point of contact for all that for all the 73 folks for the state. As far as them onboarding, outgoing, payroll issues. How do I take FMLA and pointing them in the right direction and getting all that done? So I used to have an administrative assistant that I worked with that handled all those things, and she managed my calendar and made sure I got to certain meetings on time, wherever they happened to be, and screened my visitors and so on and so forth. And yeah, I don't have that anymore.
So if anybody's got any questions, how'd they get in touch with you?
You can email me at my work email, which would be Christopher.Tomaino, Tomaino at Constellis.com, and make initial contact, and we'd be able to go from there, exchange numbers and trade information. But that happens all the time, and then I've still got relationships with folks from the FBI National Academy, having gone through that. And, that turns out to be a giant fraternity where you continue to interact with folks that went through that. You've got instant bond, instant connection to where folks are able to trade information and make relevant connections. And that's basically the same way that I ended up getting put in contact with the folks out of Florida to be able to go out there towards the end of the year to present. But that's it.
I appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you watching. But before you go, if you like the video, please hit that subscribe button. Also, any comments are appreciated. Thank you.